of being together, as Lorenza Gamba and many other discussants underlined, is the great point of our society. The mistake we make in thinking about the normality of life and the normality of our approach to knowledge, to relations, and to the city is something that we cannot go further with it. As the fear we feel in living together in last years is not an occasional reaction to a particular stress, but is the result of the feeling that we have lived in on a stage with false ideas about society. So the reaction on the threats and the risk make the situation more and more difficult to manage, as we cannot recognize the otherness and the other by itself, even if is so likely with us. But the moment in which we must live together, we are trying to find different forms of cities or relations. As I said yesterday, we are trying to plan a new kind of cities, like the 50 mini cities. But what about the meaning of the city, the imagination beyond the idea of the city, of innovation, of relations, of rationality? We are closing ourselves in a little group, in little groups, maybe just to gain some power on events. But maybe this can be the greatest failure of as human beings, because we cannot give a limit to the risks. Like the virus show up without recognizing a limit and government or groups, we have to be more like the virus. We have to understand that we must live together, and we have to find new responses to our questions. For the moment, I close here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabella, for these suggestions and ideas and reflection on how to deal with the diversity and risks that are eventually connected to it. And we'll go back to that with questions in the end. Now, the next paper is from Gabe Mitten, together with Laura Negler and Taran Leaks. It's called, from University of Liverpool. It's called What Now and Where Next for Climate Emergency Activists, Gazing into Elongating Shadow Shed by the Pandemic. Gabe, the floor is yours. You're going to present.
Thank you, super. I'm just sharing my slides now, so hopefully you can see those.
We don't see them in presentation mode, but many of us did not manage today, including myself. So if you manage to put it in presentation mode, would be better, but otherwise we can see it quite clearly.
Okay, well, we'll carry on as we are then.
Okay,
okay, so just a little bit of background to this presentation. Obviously speaking on behalf of myself, Taran Leaks and Laura Nagle are all based at the University of Liverpool. So just a bit about the project itself. So it's very much a work in progress. So it's a small scale acorn study. Our ambition is to reach a target of 25 participants, and we're edging at the moment towards half of that number. So our idea really is to be experimental, to be investigative, and to see if we can have something that we might want to build into a broader study with a larger number of participants. So what we're doing is we're looking at XR, Extinction Rebellion, which you'll know, of course, as a climate activism movement, and we're focusing at the moment in the northwest of England and the branch which is based there. So we've done some semi-structured interviews. We've begun a little bit of rolling thematic content analysis. When we get the full data set, we'll be using the principles of grounded theory. And we have a series of different themes that we're interested in. So it's very much experimental. It's very much trying to see whether there's something there that we might want to follow up in further detail. So what I want to do today is to present some tentative vignettes. So I want to say a little bit about the context, a little bit about why we're interested in this area of study, and then I want to present just 1 or 2 snippets of data, obviously tentatively and for reflection and comment rather than toward any conclusions. So, as you're probably aware, Extinction Rebellion is a horizontal global movement founded in the UK in 2018, but obviously now a global movement. Interested and active in challenging the environmental demise, so the deleterious consequences of capitalism. Extinction Rebellion uses this extinction symbol, which you'll see on the left-hand side as you look here, which signifies an hourglass. And the idea is that unless we act urgently, then our time on the planet is going to be very limited due to the environmental consequences of the ways in which we produce, consume, and live. So Extinction Rebellion is formally a non-violent cross-generational movement. So there are different elements of XR. There's a XR youth branch, which is very much tapped into a global network of young people involved in environmental activism. They have radical tactics in comparison with previous environmental campaign groups such as Greenpeace. In fact, their first action was to occupy the offices of Greenpeace in London. So a series of different organised attempts to disable, to interrupt, to provoke, mainly based in London. So in 2018, XR occupied 5 of the bridges which cross the River Thames in London. In 2019, they had an organised, orchestrated campaign to shut down London by occupying key sites, disrupting traffic flows, and also latterly in 2021, a range of actions of what you might call civil disobedience in the City of London in order to disrupt that area of central commerce. So the mantras, the kind of principles, if you will, of XR, tell the truth, act now, and go beyond politics. So they're very much active, they're very much interested in what Beck would call kind of sub-political direct action. So in terms of the stated demands of XR in the UK, there are 3. And again, they fit with the mantras or principles. So the idea that the government must begin telling the truth, must declare a climate emergency, and must act swiftly in order to tackle this very severe problem. XR argues that the government must get to net zero by 2025 in order to halt, in order to turn around or at least level off the climate emergency, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And also they're interested in trying to find new ways of democratic engagement around the environment and around people's health and well-being and welfare. So the idea that a citizen assembly can be developed rather than a kind of formal democratic process where people only really get to act once every 5 years or so by casting a vote. So in relation to the context, and I'm skipping through this rather rapidly because I want to get some feedback on the way in which we're shaping the project at the moment. So XR has been categorised as having extremist ideologies. So that puts it in line with Islamist and far-right groups, and as being reportable to the UK counter-radicalisation programme. So there's been very much a kind of hard sort of approach towards XR and towards its activities and its ideologies. XR has responded, I think, partly by widening its range of activities, focusing a little bit more on community building and what it calls regenerative culture. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. In relation to COVID-19, they originally cancelled a series of planned demonstrations, but as we're aware, other organised movements such as the organic Black Lives Matter protests emerged during that period. So there's some interesting questions of intersection there, and some interesting questions around the different actions of protest groups. Importantly, in 2021, the UK government, the Home Office, proposed a police crime sentencing and court bill. This is quite significant because this changes the parameters of organised protest. So in relation to previous forms of police action, the police could disperse a protest if they thought there was a risk of serious disorder. This bill proposes that anyone in the area that may feel serious unease constitutes grounds to break up a protest and disperse it, indeed to declare it illegal. Anybody found making a protest under those conditions is chargeable under criminal law. So this is a major change, not just for XR, but in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of movement, capacity to protest. So we're interested really in what all this means. How is XR responding to this? What are they doing in relation to these quite dramatic changes in relation to assembly, relating to COVID-19, but also in terms of social control by government and increasing intervention by the police. Now, one of the things that I think is striking is that they're quite concerned about negative publicity, and I would contrast that with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think dominant media representations of XR have very much tended to castigate them, actually, to suggest that their disruption is not merited, that they're basically affecting everyday citizens as they're trying to go about their everyday life, and so on and so forth. And I think this is something which troubles senior people in XR, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So these are the three, I call them research questions, or we call them research questions. They're not really. I think we're interested in the global, local intersection. So these were the three, what you might call the themes we're interested in. So the impacts of the pandemic, the articulation otherwise between XR and other activist movements, and also the impact of these formal measures of social control and surveillance. So one or two methodological limitations of note. In order to access participants, we had to go through the XR media team. So I guess that's something to reflect on in terms of the breadth of participants. And we also had to advertise through the XR Twitter account. So I think we did and have found some worries amongst participants around surveillance. So we've had quite a number of people who committed to do interviews and then pulled out. It may be coincidence, it may be busy lives, or it may be something else, some concern maybe about saying the wrong thing. And certainly there's an anxiety within XR, I think, generally about negative publicity. So what I want to do then, just for a couple of minutes before eliciting some feedback, is just to speak to each of those research areas. So first of all, in terms of the impact of COVID-19, lots of sensitivity, I think, strong reliance within the movement at the high levels on media representation as a key tactic, not only in getting the message over, but also recruiting new members. So very much a concern about receiving bad press in newspaper terms. And I think you can see there's kind of mixed responses to that within the movement. So the quote by Barry on the top right-hand side, in some ways almost sarcastic about, things being nice and artistic and questioning whether you can keep on message with the media. And then the observation by Anne, which I think is very similar, if not quite scathing. So that's one thing we've picked up so far. In relation to the second theme, so the correlation between XR and other activist movements, and I think this is important, particularly when you think about the purchase or otherwise of XR within working class communities. The space that's been left by the evacuation of left-wing Labour politics and the way in which that is currently sometimes being filled by right and far right politics. So what is that intersection between red and green, and indeed the politics of race? So some reflections here from Sue. Very much kind of continuity approach. So we don't want to do anything which is damaging. We don't want to use violence. We need to maintain that kind of cohesion and that harmony. So we act, but we don't do anything which may be perceived to be damaging or criminal. And then the observations of Barry here, which I think are increasingly resonant. You know, what's the balance here between going it alone in terms of a movement which is only focusing on the environment, or one which might include issues around gender inequality or race and ethnicity and exclusion. So I think there are some of the kind of the tensions within the movement. And also in relation to responding to increased formal and surveillance measures, it's fair to say that in the original protests in 2018 and 2019, the police were very much hands off. They were mainly observing. I think we can see a big sea change in that latterly, with the police using much more aggressive and hostile tactics. And that's not just in relation to XR and climate activism, that's also in relation to the Kill the Bill movement and the protests which took place in Bristol. So I think we've got a tension here. You know, XR wants to try and rouse people out of kind of what you might call self-seeking and self-preserving privatism in Habermasian terms, and also whether it needs to be more militant. So what's the balance between encouraging people to adopt the viewpoints which XR think are important, the behaviours, you know, to bridge that value action gap, and do they need indeed to be more militant? Do they need to do things which are increasingly risky? And I think that's the observation that Dave is making in this second quote there at the bottom. So I think we've probably said just about enough and hopefully kept to time. So not conclusions then, just quandaries. So these are things that we'd like to throw out there for some feedback. I think what we're picking up at the moment, and of course, you know, we have a lot more data to come, narratives really of what you might call tension and ambivalence. So around transformative action, around that balance between maintaining continuity and consistency with the way the movement has evolved, but also making changes to adapt to the current context. Also, I think tensions around the use of non-violent versus militant or aggressive actions, and also the tension between making alliances with other activist groups in other areas, and whether or not that would dilute the message or the capacity of XR to engage people politically. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Gaby, for this presentation, which raises a lot of questions, also in connection to a lot of other movements of this sort that are developing around the world and pose big questions about how to deal with the issue and what is also the public acceptance, I think, of different forms of activism at the moment, in a time when everybody is scared of people going in the streets. So thank you so much. And I give now the floor to Dario Pizzul, is that the correct pronunciation, from University of Milano Bicocca. And they will talk about privacy violation risk in COVID-19 digital contact tracing, Italian app users' perception versus app developers' conceptualization. Please, the floor is yours if you want to share, if you have slides.
Thank you. Yeah.
Them.
I'm sharing right away my slides. There you go. Presentation mode should be this way. Okay, so are you seeing the background, right, or the full slides? It's in the background, right?
We see your presentation. I don't know. Everybody has the same problem.
Okay, today. So it's right. Okay.
No, we just see your
okay, the behind
slide,
okay.
The black screen.
Okay. What about this way?
Yeah, that works
better.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you. So I just want to give you like a very brief overview of digital contact tracing, which is the main topic of my talk today. So, of course, we all know unfortunately about the COVID-19 pandemic, but what is probably less known is how contact tracing started to emerge. So it was a part of a broader strategy to fight this virus by the World Health Organization, who firstly give up some guidelines to tackle this issue. Contact tracing was one of these elements, but its first formulation was the so-called manual contact tracing, meaning there's some operators who should call people who got the virus to try to reconstruct the net of contacts they had. Sooner than later, it appeared that this approach was completely unfeasible to the growing number of cases. So many scholars started suggesting an approach with digital technologies. So using digital technology, especially a smartphone, to try to build this net of contacts of affected people. So a lot of players entered the arena of the debate of digital contact tracing. There was these scholars who, mainly from the privacy and the cryptography field, who debated on the best approach from the point of view of privacy. There was a national public institution that thought they should develop a tool to better cope with this need of contact tracing. And there were also corporations who entered the field, big corporations like Apple and Google, who decided to offer their contribution to make digital contact tracing work on their devices. And among all these players, the main debating issue was privacy. For instance, from the scholar's point of view, those who helped develop different protocols to utilize digital contact tracing suggest that minimizing privacy and security risk for individuals and communities was the most important thing. On the other hand, national public institutions like the Italian one suggested that privacy should be used as a selecting tool to identify the best technology to use for digital contact tracing. On their behalf, Apple and Google as well utilize privacy as a key element to guide all the different development of technology in digital contact tracing. And media also utilize privacy for framing digital contact tracing narrative through their channels. And what about the user's perspective on privacy on digital contact tracing? So before moving on the evidence from the user's perspective on privacy, the scientific literature give us some interesting notion about the user perspective on privacy. So the main idea is that, especially in the digital domain, usually users don't have full correct information on privacy. Many scholars suggest that this is sort of privacy paradox, where there's a discrepancy between how the users tell to care about privacy and how they actually behave about privacy. The most classical example is that in surveys, users tell that privacy is really important, and then when their behavior is analyzed, for instance, on social networks, they really discount their privacy. Most recently, this idea of the paradox has been criticized, but the fundamental ideas of discrepancy between attitudes and behaviors seems to stand. So a little bit more information about privacy from the scientific literature. Of course, is a very, very broad domain, and it's also started in the 19th century, but throughout the decades, the main idea is that privacy is mainly related to personal control over own information. So there's a really individual perspective over privacy. Most recently, especially due to the fact that that personal information start to become a really important source of economic value, such perspectives started to change. So many scholars start suggesting that we should start moving from an individual perspective on privacy toward a more collective idea of privacy, maybe even considering privacy as a public good. So this is really quick elements from the scientific literature help us to go through to this main research question, that is how experts and users involved in digital contact tracing in Italy deal with privacy related to these technologies. The hypothesis comes from the first contribution that I mentioned a few seconds ago about the fact that users don't have full information on privacy. So the idea here is that probably experts present deeper concern about privacy and pay more attention to it compared to end users of digital contact tracing. So what I've done here is conducting 17 semi-structured interviews and then support them with the analysis of some documents, mainly because I was missing the perspective of Apple and Google, which refused to offer further information with respect to their official statement. Here you can see the classification of my interviewees, mainly people coming from the task force of the Innovation Ministry who selected the Italian app for digital contact tracing. I interviewed some scholars who were involved in developing the protocols for digital contact tracing at the European level. And then I interviewed some of the technicians who developed the different apps who were proposed to the Innovation Ministry, computer science scholars, local healthcare authorities that were supposed to use this app. And then I had the chance just to get in touch with one person from the European community who was dealing with digital contact tracing integration at the European level. And what about users? I thought that the best way to understand user perspective toward digital contact tracing was to analyze the app reviews under the Immuni, which is the app for digital contact tracing in Italy on the Google Play Store. So I scraped all the reviews from June 2020 to June 2021 for a data set of around 23,000 reviews. Then I cleaned them and I've applied this natural language processing technique, a very simple one, to understand what are the main topics that emerge from this broader data set of reviews. Then, since I'm interested in the privacy perspective, I just selected the reviews who were dealing with privacy. I divided them between top ranked with 4 and 5 stars reviews and bottom ranked with 1 and 2 star reviews. And then I analyzed around 100 reviews for each one of these groups. 2 limitations emerge from this approach. Of course, representativity, even though there's a big data set of 23,000 reviews, not all the users' perspective is represented here. And then some problems could emerge from comparing evidence from small text like reviews and larger text like semi-structured interviews. But I think some interesting conclusion can be drawn anyway from these different approaches. So what about the expert conceptualization of privacy? Privacy was their main concern. They focus largely on privacy during the digital contact tracing development. It guided the selection process, like from these experts from the report from the task force of the Innovation Ministry, who decided which app should have gone through the selection for deciding the technology at the national level. The expert clearly states that privacy was the topic for selecting the technology. And moreover, it was interesting to notice that privacy was something to protect in time of uncertainty, especially for the scholars who developed the different protocols. The idea for them was that they were not sure that digital contact tracing would have worked because it was a new technology, but the risk of privacy violation was very high. So they decided to favor privacy instead of different technological application because the damage on privacy were certain, while the success of the technology and the approach of digital contact tracing was not certain. And finally, all the scholars share the idea that, especially on media, privacy was wrongly criticized because they care a lot about privacy and they developed a tool that was really privacy preserving, while on the media, it was still criticized a lot. What about the user perception? So I've done this n-gram analysis, as I told you, but privacy really didn't emerge in the first analysis when considering the groups of 3 words in the reviews, because the main topic that emerged were technical issues, the fact that the app was useless or useful, or issue with signaling the fact that people were positive contacts. So they've gone down to the two words, couple of two words, and even in this case, privacy was not emerging. While if we consider the top 20 most mentioned words in the reviews, privacy was here. So I just selected those 1,102 reviews and I decided to analyze them. What I found here is that most of the reviews were signaled with 5 stars and very few reviews were signaled with 1 and 2 stars. So what are the most relevant topics that emerge from the reviews perspective? Users don't seem to value privacy that much. I can read you one of these reviews and you're gonna understand right away. So one user say that, I agree with those who say that in this case, the public good should prevail over our privacy and the authorities should impose as far as the lockdowns data registration. As you can see here, many users decide to discount their privacy in favor of a better working, in their opinion, digital contact tracing solution. Moreover, users said that we should not complain about the use of privacy in digital contact tracing when there's firms doing business with our privacy. Once again, I read you one of the reviews and you can understand this perspective. So many claims on privacy when immune is free and open source software, and maybe use Facebook, Instagram, Google services and give a tons of data every second to commercial purpose. Please be coherent. So you can understand how also this idea of data generating economic value is pretty eradicated in users as well. And as the experts show in the interviews, also in the reviews, users show that they think that privacy was guaranteed with this solution of digital contact tracing. So cruising to the end, what's the relation between the expert perception and the user perception of privacy? It emerged that privacy was the main concern for experts involved in digital contact tracing development, and for users it doesn't seem to be the same because they kind of discount their privacy. In fact, users underestimate how other digital contact tracing configuration could harm their privacy, while experts at the time and competencies to make deeper consideration on it. On a common point, both experts and users consider Immuni as a wrongly criticized for privacy and data protection concerns. And finally, users show awareness about firms and online data use. So as a conclusion of this contribution, at the beginning, I had the chance to say that scientific literature suggests that users don't have complete information on privacy, and it seems that there's evidence emerge here as well. Experts play a key role in developing a tool largely based on data, but with strong privacy preserving features. So they had the chance to send out a very, very privacy preserving tool for digital contact tracing. And finally, also due to the institutional nature of the project, many dimensions of digital contact tracing that involve privacy have been defined by experts and not left open by individual decision. GPS, for instance, was one of the topics that experts decided to not include in the app because it could be privacy violating. And finally, it seems to come to the second stream of literature that I presented to you before, that in this case, thanks to the role of expert, privacy was managed as a collective matter, not just an exclusive individual one, leaving all the burden of decision on the individual's shoulder. So perhaps this could be a new way or a way to using a new approach over privacy decision, especially when dealing with digital technology. And with that, I thank you. And whether there's questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dario, for this very interesting research that to a certain extent confirms what many of us probably thought, that about this privacy, there was a huge debate among experts, but less concern among the public. So we can go back to that now with the question, because I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience. I think we got very interesting and stimulating papers. So if anybody has questions to raise to one or more of the presenters, please go on. Also, the presenters obviously can pose questions to the others if you wish.
Maybe I will ask something to Gabe, because I must confess, I've read some of your books and I was really impressed. I would like to investigate more on the symbolic side of risk and what can be the meaning of it in our day society. Thank you. And maybe to Dario, I'm very interested in his presentation. It was very well done, very well addressed. And the sense of privacy, do you think can be assessed in our society? And how can we conceptualize it? Because we are racing to show up more and more every day in an online version of our lives, and maybe privacy is no more has no more meaning, or you will explain to me. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Thanks very much for that really interesting point, Isabella. I mean, I think the symbolic and the aesthetic are increasingly important. When you think back to the work of Scott Lash and others, connecting aesthetics to reflexivity and risk has been a kind of significant moment. I think even then, the kind of importance of the symbolic realm couldn't have been predicted, and obviously media and mediation is absolutely critical. I think what's interesting about that is I think there are some generational differences in relation to aesthetics and symbolism, and its importance in relation to the way it connects together with values and beliefs. So I think, you know, the adoption of memes, for example, the use of emojis, engagement with gaming platforms, all those kind of forms of activity which are pretty much standard for young people, I think do signal some different modes of socialization and more intense attachments to those modes of networking and socialization. And that's something that Beck spoke a little bit about in the last unfinished book and the last chapter. And I think that is important because that connects together with the idea of metamorphosis, the idea of a dramatic shift in ways of communication. And I think what we don't know is, you know, how do those things connect to potentially harmful, deleterious tendencies? To what extent do they offer emancipatory opportunities? And I think that's probably a space where we could probably do with doing quite a bit more research.
Dario?
Sure. So I think the point is how we can assess privacy. It's a really difficult question because I think there's two dimensions of privacy. There's the fact that privacy is mainly an individual topic. So from that, the perspective of each individual could change. But on the other hand, I think there's the collective perspective over privacy. Since, especially how I was trying to say before, personal data became important source of economic value, probably we should start to move from the idea of just an individual perspective on privacy towards a broader evaluation of experts over privacy. Just a quick example, for instance, when privacy was first introduced by scholars in 1890s, the idea was that privacy was a matter of getting picture posted on newspapers. So there was this violation of their of one own image. On the other hand, I think that today with the digital technologies, we're moving towards a very, very different approach towards privacy, because could be a matter of fact that most of us don't care a lot about their online data, but these data, when they're aggregated with other people's one, they create enormous economic value for those who are able to analyze them. So I think that probably we should really give the chance to set a standard for privacy protection to those who really understand what is the value of this data. Because, for instance, I don't think that my personal data value that much, but when a company aggregates my data with those of many other people, those information start to have a significant value. So I think that this perspective is really hard to grasp from an individual point of view, while if we move privacy from a collective point of view and just experts who have knowledge on the way how digital technologies work, really understand, probably we can change the perspective over privacy and give it the real value that it has. So this is my view on this point.
Yeah, if I may get into this at the moment, I don't know, I want to be just a little bit provocative, but you say, I mean, all the literature says that people don't have enough information to really understand this issue of privacy, but on the other hand, do they need to? What I mean is that obviously there is a gap there, and Isabella is right when she says, otherwise we would not have a surveillance culture. People would not contribute themselves to surveillance of themselves and others. So they make a big contribution to that every day, opening their phone and so on and so forth. So there is a certain, let's say, feeling or vision from the individual point of view. And then there is the task and the duty of the institution, of the state, or whatever we consider as an institution to protect people against the use and instrumental use of data for economic purposes. So these things, what I think is at the moment, they do not really match. And how do we find a match between these two different perspectives? And I don't know if giving more room or more space to the experts, conceptualization of privacy would be the key. Because if you look at the case of Immuni, I mean, your research is very interesting from that point of view, but I think a bit the same was all over Europe. Most of the people, the main problem was not in people downloading the app. The problem for them was that the app did not work in a sense that did not help to do contact tracing, did not help people to get care when they need it. So, but this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because as you already said in your presentation, the experts, the developers, they choose privacy over efficient implementation. That was a choice that was made from the beginning. And so we don't have to wonder if the results were the ones we saw. So it is a quite a complex issue there, because from the point of view of the people, okay, you can trace me as far as this helps me to solve my health problems or to identify cases around me. But if that does not work, then obviously I don't trust you anymore. So this is the mechanism. And what I mean is that it was embedded already in the way they decided to design this product, choosing certain legitimate, I'm not saying they should have not done that, but choosing privacy over efficient implementation of the app, or not. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I have the main focus of my PhD dissertation is indeed this one. So understanding what went went wrong trying to reconstructing the governance of the digital contact tracing. And the point is indeed what you made. So the issue was not technical, it was organizational. So developers were not able to design not only the digital technology, but also the infrastructure on which this technology should be embedded. So the problem was right away that. And of course, there was an issue of communication. So indeed, the problem was to really understand how different components of these infrastructure should work within these broad strategies of digital contact tracing. And one last point on privacy. What I think is that so there's a trade-off we should understand on risk over privacy, because of course data are really valuable. I'm not saying that we should not extract value from data, but of course there's some personal information that should be protected. And probably us as individual, we don't have the competencies of evaluating those risks. Because for instance, these individual perspective over privacy has been already employed through the terms of use. Every time we enter a website or we use a app where there's a long page of terms of use, and we don't have either the time, competencies to understand those terms of use. So what I'm saying, and what I see that some authors are suggesting is that we should present product services that are privacy preserving already, so we don't put the burden of this decision over users. Users, of course, are free to choose whether to use it or not, but at least a minimum level of privacy is guaranteed through this evaluation of somebody else who is more competent. Of course, like privacy authorities in countries somehow try already to do that, but it's something that should be more evaluated.
There are questions from other participants. Otherwise, I can pose two issues to Gabe about is it very interesting research. Okay, the first one you already discussed a bit earlier, but in terms of continuity, I would also ask myself, how is that this issue of performativity? You said, do something, they want to do something performative, they say in their interviews. And how different is that from the old law of communication, then the medium is the message? So how new forms, technologies, now that we are out of mass communication that McLuhan was thinking about, how that changes the true meaning of what we are doing, because there is a change, obviously, in symbols, in mediums, but probably the basic was already there. It's just something that came to my mind. I'd like you to comment on that. And then the other issue, which I find interesting, because I'm following now, it's not really a research, it's sort of something I'm doing with my postgrad students to follow these Fridays for Future demonstrations. And one thing that I find really interesting, which gave a different quality to their protest, was this putting the issue of climate justice in the middle. So what it means, this goes with the question you posed, should they go alone or should they get into a broader framework of revendication, of protests, of demands to the power? And that was obviously very interesting to me, because obviously links very much to all the debates that you are very familiar with about risk and inequalities. So it was a way where basically all the puzzle to a certain extent. When this issue of climate justice came up, was sort of the puzzle coming all together, and we are connecting different problems to their core meaning in a way. So do you see anything like that in this specific movement you are studying? How do they connect to more general issues in relation not only to environment, but to global risks of any sort?
Yeah, thanks, Maria Grazia. A fascinating set of questions, I think. Yeah, I'll just offer some comments on that. I mean, I think the obvious thing to say is obviously the capability of new media to enable the connectivity, which has been important in terms of particularly young people and the Fridays movement, you know, so connecting together people, not just young people, not just across Europe, but the world, into a movement where you can kind of feel the actions being shared, even though they might not be proximate. So I think that's the obvious observation. I mean, I think McLuhan referred to technologies as being extensions of man, didn't he? Which, you know, is a man in parentheses.
A bit like performers do.
Say again, sorry?
A bit like performers do.
Yeah.
Yesterday night we discussed about that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the embedded nature of media now, even compared to say 30 years ago, is just a kind of normalized form of communication. So I think in relation to the question around capability, capacity, coherence, I think one of the problems that I would identify is about the nature of the composition of people involved in various movements. You know, particularly in environmental activist movements. So I think if this is to have any purchase, not just in the UK, but globally, it needs to bring with it a large proportion of the populace. And I think it would be a fair observation to say that there's definitely a kind of class dimension to XR, let's say. And I think the task is persuading people to be involved in that movement, to get involved in purposive action in the context in which people are generally bound up with, you know, the quotidian, you know, bound up with meeting basic survival needs. And I think that's the problem. If you look at this kind of splinter movement, Insulate Britain, which is relatively recently formed, the protesters there engaging in direct action, you know, blocking motorways and so on and so forth. But it doesn't seem to me to be you know, young working class people that are involved in that. You know, it's retired vicars and teachers and doctors and so on and so forth. So I think there are some things there around class that are quite important. How can, you know, a wide range of red, green, black activist movements capture people across the class dimensions? And in relation to XR, yeah, not exclusively, but I think I would say, having talked to people within XR, that there are some tensions between XR Youth, which is which is part of the movement, but has its own autonomy, as it were, and their feelings about, you know, how things might change and the nature of transformation and what's required politically, and some people from the elder generations, and that probably mirrors the kind of feeling out there. It is, whether you like it or not, more urgent for young people than it is for people of my age, you know, from a kind of rational choice point of view. So I think there are, you know, that's kind of expectable in some regards. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the set of questions. I think it's more, yeah, it's more about trying to find spaces of intersection. And the problem with them, not the problem, but the issue in a movement like XR, when it's horizontal, is there isn't a command structure. You know, it wouldn't wash for the leaders of XR to say, okay, everybody, we're now going to couple up with, you know, for example, Kill the Bill, or we're now going to couple up with Black Lives Matter. You know, that would be antithetical to the organic philosophy of the movement. So yeah, I think it's a lot to unravel, but certainly at the moment it seems quite disparate and quite splintered in the UK at least.
So how does that work then when we did all the sort of censorship they do and what they say to the media? Because you talk about they do a lot of self-restraint, you know, when they talk to you or when they talk to the media. And that is not through a chain of command that says, or is just a self-restraint from individual participants?
Yeah, I think it's more from individuals. I mean, this is why we would need to go on to have a much larger and broader sample, because you could argue that we're getting a particular viewpoint. You could argue that some of the more cautious people within XR who may feel at risk of saying the wrong thing may not want to participate, and so we might be getting a lot of outlying views from people who have a very strong feeling. So that's one of the problems. I mean, you know, I understand we were invited to go through XR centrally, which I think, you know, was sensible to some regard. But yeah, I don't know. It's difficult to know because they're the kind of things that people won't want to talk about. But it's certainly we're getting the feeling amongst the interviews that we've looked over so far that there is amongst some people kind of, you know, a strong awareness that you don't say or do something that might look out of kilter with the principles of the movement. But also within that, there are also people who feel like there needs to be a step change, you know, feel like the action needs to be more visible, more frequent, of greater magnitude. So as I said, there's a lot of ambivalence, I think.
Other comments? So, I mean, if also the audience has reduced a little bit, but I guess after 2 days of intense talking, everybody is starts to be a little bit tired. So if you don't have other comments, I thank you once again for your presentations, which were very interesting, and I hope to see you in the next meetings, and thank you very much.